Hey guys, it's Katie, and I'm here today to talk about parallels, relationships, and love in the Realm of the Elderling series. For those of you who don't know, this is like my favorite series of all time, and I've done quite a few videos on it before. So if you are new here and you haven't read the series at all, I'd recommend checking out the spoiler-free review that I did or the reading order, or both, and then if you choose to read them, definitely feel free to come back once you're finished. But this is going to be a very spoiler-filled video for the entire series, so if you haven't read any of them, I'm going to say come back later. But if you have read all of the books in the series, welcome. I have a lot to talk about today. I have no idea how I'm structuring this video yet, but I have no idea how this is going to go, so sit tight and I hope you guys enjoy. So let's just launch right on into talking about some parallel things. The biggest parallels you can see throughout the entire series is the parallel between Fitz and Kennit. And I think that's absolutely a fascinating parallel to me because I don't think a lot of people think about it when they're reading, but the difference between Fitz and Kennit is he was born a bastard, but he's kind of thrust into more of a royal role, and he kind of has to adapt and become what other people want him to become. Kennit was kind of born in a really high, well-off trader family, and then he was beaten, abused, and basically just destroyed and ultimately died, we'll get there, at the hands of these specific people, and ultimately he took that brokenness and created a persona for himself and ultimately was up above it. So I mean, we have the parallel of these two people being something and then being forced to be something that they don't want to be. But then we also have the fact that they bonded with a specific thing or being. We have Fitz, who bonded with Night Eyes, who's a wolf, and we have Kennit, who has this special bond with his family life ship, the Paragon. Just how both of those characters ended up saving both Fitz and Kennit from their untimely death, and just kind of how that bond was strengthened and how their essences kind of mixed together to create this new being. As we know, at the end of Royal Assassin, Fitz was basically on death's door until he escaped into Night Eyes and lived through him for a time. But once they separated in Assassin's Quest, they were never really able to go back to being what they were before. Night Eyes tried to go off by himself for a time and live as a wolf by himself, but because he had so many of these human aspects, he couldn't do it. And the same thing with Fitz. He just wasn't properly fit for being a human. He wasn't aware of certain human things. He had a lot of wolfish characteristics, and that kind of made him even more of an outcast than he already was. Kennit, on the other hand, was beaten and almost died aboard the Paragon, and the Paragon ultimately brought Kennit back from death, but not without commingling part of himself once again. Kennit and the Paragon have this incredible link that will not be shaken, because if you don't know, if once someone's blood has been spilt on a live ship, they soak up the blood and they will never forget, that kind of a thing. And so I mean, the bond between the Paragon and Kennit is just extra strong because of that. So it's just really interesting to see those parallels, not only with their backstories and their overall lives, but with a lot of things that they went through. I mean, even the characters that they've surrounded with themselves can be, there can be some parallels drawn. For instance, we have Fitz and his relationship with Molly and his relationship with the Fool. And then we have Kennit with his relationship with Etta and his relationship with Wintrow. And they're both, like, just both of those parallel storylines have similarities to them. For instance, I see a really big similarity with Fitz and Molly as with Kennit and Etta. They don't, both of them kind of have unhealthy aspects of their relationships, but they're both there for Kenneth slash Fitz no matter what. They are willing to be there for them no matter what the cost. And the same thing is with the relationship between Fitz, Fool, and Kenneth and Wintrow. Fitz and the Fool have this very unusual, gorgeous, beautiful, unbreakable bond, and we're going to talk about them at length down later in the video. But Kenneth and Wintrow also have a similar bond, but not quite to the same extent as with Fitz Fool. It's more of a situation where Kenneth, I'm pretty sure, loved Wintrow in a way that Wintrow was probably uncomfortable with. And Wintrow was just definitely loved Kenneth in a certain way, and they really formed this kind of unshakable bond in a very, very short period of time. And ultimately, because of that, those feelings that Kenneth was having, their very conflicted feelings, that ultimately is what led to Althea's rape. And then when you go to Fool's Fate, you have a similar situation with Fitz, the Fool, and the Pale Woman, because when Fitz is looking for the Fool, he gets captured by the Pale Woman, and the Pale Woman is trying to seduce Fitz in this very uncomfortable way, and the Fool is being tortured by her and her henchmen. And it's just another one of those parallels that you see with this like weird conflicting feelings with some kind of peril in between, or this like putting another character into a really, really awful situation. And I just find the parallels to be so incredibly interesting to me, and I don't know, I just really enjoyed it. But then also switching gears a little bit, talking about the parallels between the way that dragons are portrayed in the Six Duchies and the way that dragons and elderlings are portrayed in the Rainwilds. And it's really interesting because they're almost opposite of each other. So the way it works in the Six Duchies is people with the skill create a stone dragon and then put their memories inside it and then kind of live through the dragon. So it's almost as if they're creating this special art that they then preserve themselves in. In the Rainwilds, it works, as I said, kind of opposite. The dragons create art out of the humans and allow them to have these special abilities, like living longer lives and kind of living through the dragons in a way. The dragons and the humans, or the elderlings, kind of have this symbiotic relationship. And just seeing the reverse of that in the same world is just absolutely fascinating to me. And I really, really enjoyed that aspect as well. And just also kind of like the use of the wit versus the skill, and just kind of how different societies view those different magics throughout the series. The skill is the one that is most well known, but not everyone has the same name for it or the same understanding of it. And it's fascinating to watch that all unfold as the series goes on as well. I think those might be the main parallels that I wanted to talk about, because they're the most pervasive. But I mean, the thing about Robin Hobb's world is it is all so intertwined, and it's just so well done that it's unbelievable. And a lot of people miss this, like these small things here and there, because one, the series is so large, and two, you might not remember everything upon first read. But I mean, she does this thing where in Assassin's Quest, we get this vision of Verity as he's stealing something from somewhere. And when we go later into the series in City of Dragons, we find out where he stole it from and what he was stealing. And it's just really beautifully tied together. And it just blows my mind that she's able to create this world that's so vast and expansive and intertwined. It's just beautiful. But now let's talk about some of the relationships in the overall series. I'm going to save talking about Fitz and his relationships for kind of later. For right now, I'm going to start talking about first the relationships in the live ship traders, and then also the relationships in the Rainwild Chronicles, because I could probably get through those a little bit quicker. Starting with those relationships in the live ship traders, the primary relationships of that series and the pervasive relationships of that series are those between the traders and their live ships. And I've already kind of touched on a little bit about what their relationships are like. It's like some weird combination of the skill and the wit, but more skill than anything else, because it's basically once 3 generations of a family dies on the live ship, the live ship quickens and comes to life. And these ships are seen as, I don't want to call them impervious, but they are more magical, unusual, and can do all of these incredible things that normal ships can't do. And you form this special relationship with the ship, and the requirement of the way these ships work is you have to have someone from the family be on board at all times, otherwise bad things can theoretically happen to the ships. And it just really reminds me of the wit in a lot of ways, because when someone from a wit bond partnership dies, the other partner, the living partners, tends to have a really, really difficult time coming to grasp with the death. Some of them go insane, some of them just fall into severe depression or madness or whatever, and that's kind of shown in similar ways to the way that some of the live ships are. But also, as I talked about earlier, the relationship between the Paragon and Kennet was that of a wit bond partner in a lot of ways, and it was just incredibly fascinating to me. But some other relationships that we get to see in that trilogy are those of the Vestrit family with all of the people they interact with. And they all go on very, very different journeys and have very different interactions with people. Ronica is the head of the Vestrit family. She is the oldest female character, and at the beginning of the book we see her husband is on his deathbed, and he dies aboard their live ship, the Vivacia. And ultimately what ends up happening is the Vivacia ultimately passes down to Keffria's husband, which is big mistake in my honest opinion, and a lot of things that happen to Vivacia after the events of that passing down, because ultimately Kyle, who is Keffria's husband, takes his son Wintro, who is a man of God, up aboard this live ship, and ultimately ends up putting him into slavery and all this kinds of stuff. As I said, Ronica is just doing a lot of stuff. She has a very particular family from the Rainwilds called the Kupris family. The Kupris family is basically like the royal family from the Rainwilds, and ultimately there's a lot of stuff that happens between their families. On to Keffria. Keffria is just, we don't get much of a POV from her until a lot later, and even when we do, it's not as much as I would have liked. She's not as big of a character as some of the other players of the family, but her biggest role is being a mother. She also has a very interesting relationship with her sister Althea, and I'll talk more about Althea shortly. But Keffria, as I said, that's her mother. She's the mother of Wintro, Malta, and Selden. And she also has dealings with her husband Kyle, and she has to kind of come to terms with a lot of things regarding her relationships to her children as well as her husband. Moving on to Althea. Althea is my favorite character from the series. Althea is a sailor and a very, very independent woman in so many ways. She trained her whole life to become a trader and worked aboard the Vivacia for pretty much her whole life up to the point that, you know, Kyle took over. And so she has like this special connection to Vivacia. But when it all gets taken away from her, she doesn't know what to do. She does not handle it well. So she's just constantly working on trying to get her shit back. And she has a lot of interesting relationships along the way and a lot of hardships along the way. It's kind of a journey of finding herself and kind of creating her own destiny in a lot of ways. She also has a relationship with a fellow named Brashen. Brashen ends up being Althea's main romantic interest, but they've known each other for their whole lives pretty much, and he was the first mate under her father's crew. And so they ultimately have an interesting relationship, but ultimately they end up forming a romantic relationship and a romantic bond, and it was really, really fascinating to watch their whole relationship unfold. And in fact, I really liked how their relationship unfolded. Moving on to Malta. Malta is the most infuriating character, but she is also the one arguably with the most character growth. I hated her in the first book, and then I loved her by the end of the third book. She is such an interesting character. And basically what she is she's kind of right on the cusp of becoming an adult. She wants to become part of society and start courtships, and she just gets herself into all of these messes that she didn't realize what the repercussions would be at the beginning. And one thing I really like about her character is that once she starts to get the attention and everything and gets herself into these messes, she starts to really grow up and she really starts to come into her own, and there's just a lot of stuff happens. And her relationship with the Kupras family in particular is really, really lovely to watch. She ends up getting courted and married to Rain Kupras, who is, as I said, basically a prince from the Rain Wilds. And she wasn't so sure about that relationship at first, but then she realized she didn't really have a choice, and then ultimately she did end up falling in love with Rain. And it was really, really lovely to watch unfold. Now talking a little bit about Selden. Selden is the youngest of the Vestrits. He's pretty young at the beginning of the series, and we don't see much of him until the very, very last book and at the very end of the last book. And that's basically, he becomes so enthralled with Tintalia. Tintalia becomes basically his, we'll call her a wit bond partner, but not. Like, he is one of the first new elderlings because of his, and he becomes kind of a diplomat between the dragons and the people. And so he ultimately ends up with a very, very important role. And just watching his relationships with the dragons is one that I really, really enjoyed seeing. Malta also has some relationship things going on with the dragons, but not quite to the extent that Selden does. But I still really enjoyed getting to see it all unfold regardless. And finally, talking about Wintro. Poor Wintro is forced to be aboard the Vivacia by his father, despite him being a man of God and basically being training and being a priest. But ultimately he gets sold into slavery by his father, which is disgusting. I mean, think about it. Your parent selling you into slavery because you weren't obeying them. Disgusting. But then once Kennet captures the Vivacia and sets all the slaves free, he takes Wintro on as a crew member and teaches him a lot about the ways of the world as Kennet sees it. And Wintro actually has a lot of really interesting things that happen in the books because he deals with Kennet and Edda, and he gets to just have a really interesting time of it at sea because he's been through the ringer, that poor boy. And ultimately he, as I talked about earlier, the relationship that forms between him, Edda, and Kennet is definitely a very interesting one. Plus, he's also aboard the Vivacia, and he kind of forms a special bond with her as well. And so it's just really, really interesting to see how that all unfolds and the relationship that he ultimately ends up having with all of these people. In a lot of ways, Robin Hobb's books are very, very relationship centric. Like, it's all about characters, it's all about the character growth, and the Live Ship Traders trilogy is kind of the epitome of what that means. Now, moving on to the Rainwilds briefly, a lot of the Rainwilds is kind of a found family kind of a situation. We have all of these misfit outcasts from the Rainwilds that are so deformed and changed by the Rainwilds that they're not expected to live long for society. But they end up going on this journey with the newly formed dragons and kind of take them to their safe haven, basically. And in the process, they become elderlings. And not only do they become elderlings, but they also kind of start forming all kinds of different unique relationships with each other. Like, our main four characters are Elise, Leftrin, Cedric, and Thymara. And just watching all of them and all of their relationships, things, and all of their interactions is definitely really interesting. Elise is a character that I really, really, really identify with because of the way that she just is. I am literally her. If I was a book character, it would be argued that I am mostly her. But she ends up getting married to this absolute despicable, awful, abusive person named Hest. And Hest is a gay dude. And literally no one knows that except for Elise's best friend, Cedric. And the reason Cedric knows about it is because he is the person that Hest is in a relationship with, kind of on the side. And ultimately, Elise has a very unusual relationship with Hest in that, as part of their marriage contract, he agreed to let her go to the Rainwilds to study dragons. And he doesn't want to enforce that contract, but she goes, and Cedric goes along with her, which in the long run ends up being a really good thing. Cedric and Elise have a very complicated relationship. Elise thinks they're closer than they are, but Cedric is just deceiving her left and right. And when it all comes to a head, a lot of stuff happens, but ultimately they end up kind of joining forces and becoming better and closer friends than they were in the first place, because they both have to deal with their kind of abusiveness with Hest, and they in turn find these better, healthier relationships along the way. Elise ultimately gets together with Leftrin, and Leftrin has a very sketchy and unusual past. Cedric has to deal with his feelings and messy situation with Hest, but he ultimately ends up being in a better relationship with a guy named Carson. And Carson is a hunter and a kind of like a wild, rugged man. And they form one of my favorite relationships from the entire series, honestly. But then Thymara also gets herself into this interesting love triangle, and it portrays love in a unique way, struggling with what she wants and also the things that she's afraid of. And the relationships that she primarily gets to deal with are those between not only Centaura, who is her dragon patron person, but then also Tats, which is a young tattooed slave boy that she's known for a long time, and also a boy named Rapskull, who is severely touched by the Rainwilds, just as Thymara is. And just watching the relationship unfold between those three in general is very interesting to watch. Thymara and Rapskull have a very particular kind of relationship, especially as the books go on. And Tats and Thymara also have this very unusual kind of relationship as well. And they are ultimately the ones that end up together. And but the journey that they go through to get there is very, very interesting. So yeah, I mean, just getting to watch this found family unfold and watch all of the trials and tribulations and frustrations that they go through together is definitely an interesting one to watch. But then also getting to know the dragons and how they interact with humans is also really interesting, because you find out more about elderlings and more about what the dragons were like and what they're supposed to be like and how they think and how they experience things and just their overall lives. And so watching them not only interact with themselves, but also to interact with the humans and the elderlings that they create is also very, very interesting to watch. And it becomes a core part of the series in a lot of ways. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Fool, because the Fool is unusual in that he is in multiple trilogies. He's in the first 3 trilogies, and the only character who is in both the Fitz trilogies and the Live Ship Traders trilogy. He didn't have anything to do with the Rain Wilders, but yeah, there's a lot to do with the Fool. So we first meet the Fool in the Farseer trilogy when he goes to Buckkeep and he basically meets Baby Fitz and he kind of befriends him, and he also becomes Shrew's court jester. And it's really interesting. The Fool is literally my favorite character. Like, the second he walked on the page, I knew he was going to be my favorite. I was just like, you are my favorite. And I couldn't pinpoint why, but I just loved him from the second he walked on the page. Just so fun. And as I said before, I'm going to talk about Fitz's and the Fool's relationship at length, because there's a lot to unpack there. But I'll get there later when I talk about Fitz. Basically, Fitz and the Fool's relationship is kind of like the key and the core to everything in this series. And that's basically all you need to know about that. But the Fool also takes many personas and many forms throughout these series. In Farseer, he's the Fool. He is basically a court jester. Great, cool. In the Live Ship Traders trilogy, the Fool is a person called Amber. So the Fool is basically a gender-bent, genderqueer character. And the persona of Amber in the Live Ship Traders trilogy is also really important because of the interactions that they have with certain characters like Malta, for instance. The Fool, as we found out in Assassin's Quest, got some skill/silver on his fingers, and so then he can so now he has to permanently wear a glove all the time. Well, there was one time where in the Live Ship Traders trilogy, he took the glove off and he touched Malta on the back of her neck, I think, and she has some fingertips there on her neck. And it's said to be a good omen or a mark of greatness if you have that on you. And she ultimately went on to be a really, really great and powerful character and person throughout the series. I mean, that interaction was very key. But also, Amber gave the Paragon a new face. And he gave the Paragon the face of Fitz, who, as we know, the Fool loves Fitz with every fiber of himself. And that is a really key and important thing that happens in the book as well. Just Amber has a lot to add in certain aspects. Different persona, same agenda as usual, kind of. It's complicated to explain, but once you read it, it makes a lot more sense. In the Tonyman trilogy, the Fool portrays himself as this fellow named Lord Golden, who is a Jamilian noble. And that's a very, very interesting thing to watch as well, because Fitz gets to interact with this different persona that the Fool has, and it's just, it furthers their relationship even. And then, once again, in Fitz and the Fool trilogy, we see the Fool in multiple personas, primarily Amber, but also Mage Grey and sort of Lord Golden. So we get a weird mix of everything in the final trilogy. But the Fool is a very, very important character in the overall series. Now it's time to get on to talking a little bit about Fitz and his relationships with people. He has a lot of different kinds of relationships, and he takes on all of these different roles depending on who he's interacting with. But some of those roles kind of bleed into other things as well. I launch into talking about who each relationship is with. I'm just going to let you know that all the different types of relationships there are. So there's familial relationships, mentor-apprentice relationships, lovers, father-daughter relationships, soulmates, I don't even know. But he has so many different personas throughout the entire series that it just gave each relationship its own thing. But I'm gonna talk about Fitz's key relationships with people throughout the series. So starting with Farseer, Fitz's main relationships are with that of Shrewd, Regal, Shade, Burrick, his dogs Nosy, Smithy, Night Eyes, who is a wolf, Darling, Trikin, and Molly. I think those are the main relationships we see of Fitz throughout the Farseer trilogy. And let's just kind of touch on each one briefly. Fitz, as I said, Fitz has multiple relationships with multiple different people, and he is a different person with each one of them. And he is able to label each one of them as something, except for one of them. And I deliberately left him out of talking about this because I want to talk about them later. But let's start with that of Shrewd. Shrewd is Fitz's grandfather, and he takes Fitz in right before Chivalry gets killed. And they have an interesting relationship because not only do they have that blood relationship, which isn't portrayed in a very overt way, because Fitz's primary relationship to Shrewd is that of courtly assassin. Shade, who is Shrewd's brother, or half-brother, I think, is also a bastard. And he is the current court assassin, but he's kind of getting up in age, so it's time for Shade to start, an apprentice. So he takes Fitz under his wing and teaches him courtly assassin ways. And ultimately, the main relationship that Fitz has to both Shrewd and Shade is that of courtly assassin, spy, just whatever the crown and the Farseer line needs him to be, because he can't be out there in public life because of his bastard status. So they find other useful ways to use him. And so while they are blood related, their primary use for Fitz is not for familial bonding. Then we get to talking a little bit about Burrick. Burrick is the stable master of Buckkeep, and he kind of raises Fitz in a lot of ways. He was the best friend and kind of the hand of Chivalry. And so he ends up taking Fitz in, and he teaches Fitz a lot of things about, hard work and loyalty and just learning all of these important things like how to take care of an animal and how to raise animals. But another thing that Burrick does is discourage the use of the wit that Fitz has. Burrick also has the wit, but he knows a lot of bad things about it that he believes Fitz does not know or should not know. So he, in my opinion, in poor advisement, just really harms Fitz by taking away some of the only friends that he has. Like, for instance, Nosy was Fitz's first wit bond animal, and I'll talk about the wit bond situation shortly, but Burrick takes him away because he doesn't want Fitz to have this bond for a lot of reasons, as you find out as you read the books. Burrick really, really cares for Fitz and for Fitz's well-being, and it's really hard when Fitz does not understand that for a large majority of his life. Now, moving on to talking a little bit about the wit bonds, except for Night Eyes, because I'm going to talk about him separately. But Fitz had wit bonds primarily with Nosy and Smithy were two different dogs on different occasions, and both of them ended up getting killed and affected Fitz very deeply, because that's what happens when a Whit Bond partner dies. Nosy was taken away from Fitz for a long time at the beginning of Farseer, and Fitz is not reunited with Nosy until later in his life, and Nosy basically saves Fitz's life once again, and dies in the process. The same thing happens with Smithy. So both of Fitz's earliest Whit Bond partners end up getting killed. Fitz also has a special affinity of being able to communicate well with horses. So the way the Whit Bond works is you usually have an affinity for a certain type of animal. For Fitz, it's primarily dog-like creatures, but he also has a special, unique affinity with horses as well. And that's something you see as the series goes on. You see it first with Sooty, who is Fitz's horse for a long time in the first trilogy, and then you see it again in the later trilogies with primarily with the horse that he rides in Fool's Quest, and I forget the name of that horse, but they also have a potential of Whit bonding, but Fitz just refuses because of his bond with Night Eyes. So he has this special bond with these guys, and then they ultimately end up dying, and Fitz just has a hard time with it. But then in Royal Assassin, he comes across this wolf, and that wolf turns out to be Night Eyes, and they form kind of the ultimate bond of all of Fitz's other Whit Bonds. They will sacrifice everything for each other. Their essences have become commingled because of a lot of reasons, primarily because Night Eye saved Fitz at the end of Royal Assassin by allowing Fitz to live in his body for a period of time while he kind of recovered. They just have such a deep connection, and they are basically inseparable and kind of two halves of a whole in a lot of ways. And it's just very, very interesting. They are each other's family in a lot of ways because they can't live among their own kind because of the way that they've handled and dealt with each other. And it's really interesting and also really heartbreaking to watch in some respects, because once Night Eyes dies, Fitz is just kind of a shell of a person for a while. He just really has a really, really tough time dealing with that loss. And there are other animals throughout the series that he kind of has a connection with as well, like Motley. Despite Motley being more attached to the Fool than Fitz, I really do think there was some kind of connection there regardless of that, because of Fitz's and the Fool's connection, if you know what I mean. But Fitz also gets to deal a lot more with people like old blood people, like Dutiful, and people like that. And it's just really interesting getting to see Fitz deal with his wit bonds and other people who are witted as well. And now talking a little bit about some of the other people. He had all of these kind of like side relationships and romantic relationships with, I think, 3 main women. So there was Starling, Molly, and Jenna. Jenna and Starling were just kind of more enjoyable, pleasurable company kind of things. He never really felt any deeper attachment to either of them. It was just kind of like, oh, you're convenient and you're there for me. Okay, cool. But they never really understood or accepted everything about Fitz. They wanted more, or they didn't like certain aspects about him. And so that ultimately is what kind of drove him away from both of them. Then there was Molly, and Molly and Fitz's relationship is a very interesting one. They had a very, very toxic relationship when they were younger. It was just built on lies, deceit, and kind of usefulness, and it really was not, it was just a really, really unhealthy relationship. When we get to the end of Fool's Fate, they kind of both of them have changed drastically in a lot of ways, but they still have that connection because Nettle was conceived and she's now a lot older. And so they ultimately end up coming together and creating a family. Molly, I think, realizes that she's only going to get a certain amount of fits. It's not going to be a really big thing, if you know what I mean. And it's really interesting because just watching that relationship become what it was towards the end of the series, their relationship is not what you would expect it to be. Fitz is constantly still lying to Molly and withholding information from her about certain aspects of his life. He just wants what he has with her to be separate from everything else, and so he just doesn't share full parts of him. I mean, he identifies himself as her husband because they are married, and he's the father of a couple of her children and stepfather to other children. He's Holder Tom. Like, he just kind of recreates a new life for himself and really just kind of tries to put everything else from his childhood aside. And it's just really heartbreaking to watch because Molly, no matter what, she stands by Fitz through all of it. She's there for him regardless of whether she knows he's lying to her or if he's just kind of reverting to himself or something along those lines. And it's just really interesting to watch that all unfold. I'm going to talk briefly about Fitz's relationships with Kettricken and Dutiful. Kettricken ultimately becomes Verity's bride. She's from the Mountain Kingdoms, and she is also kind of an outcast because of where she's from. She doesn't look like anyone else. She's a woman. She's in a foreign land, and she's trying to rule foreign people. And she kind of creates this lovely little friendship thing with Fitz. And she has this deep, deep affection for Fitz, even after Verity dies. And a lot of people kind of were expecting them to maybe become romantically involved, and that's not something that ever happened. Fitz was never kind of comfortable with that situation, but they were always fairly close, and Kettricken was always very kind to Fitz, and it was just a beautiful, beautiful relationship to see, especially since they formed a bond over the fact that they were outcasts and just didn't really fit into what people were expecting from them. And then talking briefly about Verity. Verity is Fitz's uncle, and ultimately he marries Kettricken, and then he goes off in search of the Elderlings because he wants to win the Red Ship War, and he sort of dies, and on this quest he possesses Fitz to produce an heir in Kettricken, and it's like weird but interesting at the same time. And ultimately they produce Dutiful, and Dutiful is, as I said, Verity and Kettricken's child, but also kind of Fitz's child at the same time. He has a lot of similar characteristics and similar personality traits to Fitz, but he also looks a bit like his father as well. It's some weird kind of a mix-up thing, and it's just really interesting to see because of how that all works out and whatnot. Fitz and Dutiful do not hit it off at first. They do not like each other at first, especially since Dutiful is so angry because he's witted and his wit bond partner is trying to bond with him or whatever. And then ultimately she gets killed. He blames Fitz and they just don't get along. But also Dutiful doesn't know who Fitz is until much, much later. And once he does find out about Fitz, he's a lot more interested and wants to know wants to solidify their bond. And he's ultimately the one that gives Fitz the title of Prince. And that also causes a little bit of tension because, once again, Fitz is thrust into this role that he has no idea what to do with. And it's just really difficult for Fitz to grasp and understand that whole situation. Finally, I want to talk about Fitz's relationships with Nettle and Bee. Nettle and Bee are Fitz's daughters. Nettle is Fitz's and Molly's daughter from when they were teens, and they have a very, very, very tense relationship, especially because Nettle thinks that Fitz abandoned her and just wanted nothing to do with her. She really resents him and kind of hates him up until kind of the middle of the second to last book. They start to kind of fix their relationship and kind of become the father and daughter duo that they never really got the chance to be. So, I mean, that's really interesting to watch. Let's talk about Bee and Fitz's relationship. They also have a very, very complicated relationship. Fitz is actually there for all of Bee's life, except for the last part of it, because she gets kidnapped and taken off to Claris. But Molly had a very difficult birth with Bee, and then Bee just wanted nothing to do with Fitz. She was afraid of him because of his skill. And Molly is ultimately the one that Bee really, really bonded with. Once Molly died, she kind of had to figure out how to bond with her father, and it was really, really difficult for her. But once they did start to bond and kind of started to get to know each other, then their lives just get upended and they don't really get to solidify that relationship into what it could have been. And it's really heartbreaking to watch because it just seems to be a recurring theme in the book that farseers don't get to spend much time with their parents. Either they get killed or they abandon them or something else happens, and it's just really, really heartbreaking to watch. And once again happens with Bee. But Bee is a really interesting character because not only is she neurodivergent, but she's a lot stronger than she looks in many, many ways. And the interesting thing about Bee is not only is she Fitz's and Molly's daughter, but she's also the Fool's. So it's a similar situation like what happened with Kettricken, Verity, and Fitz in Assassin's Quest. So anyway, all of those relationships are super interesting and just kind of super important to the overall plot. I left a few out because they're not as significant in the grand scheme of things, but now you have the kind of gist of it all. And now I want to talk to you about Fitz and the Fool. And Fitz and the Fool met at an early age, and at the time, the Fool was Shrewd's court jester, and Fitz and the Fool would periodically interact. It wasn't a regular interaction, but they would interact, and Fitz enjoyed their interactions despite also being kind of confused and weirded out because the Fool would talk in riddles or rhymes or just be really mocking and weird. And I really loved that character, just that character. Once, immediately when he came on the page, I just really liked them and their interactions. And then as the books go on, their relationship forms into something so tender and heartbreaking and tender all at once that is just so core to the series. So as I said, they met when the Fool, the court jester for Shrewd, and they started to form an unusual bond. And that bond kind of keeps up for a while, and they slowly start to kind of get to know each other. But then again, the Fool is a very, very private person. So Fitz, in a lot of ways, feels like he doesn't know the Fool. But the Fool later kind of admits that Fitz knows him better than anyone else in his life. And that really says a lot about his character because we don't get a ton of Fool backstory until much, much later in the books. Assassin's Quest is when their relationship really, really starts to build to something so tender and beautiful that it's just melts you and really starts to win you over. In Assassin's Quest, Fitz is finally starting to come out of Night Eyes and reacquainting himself with the world. and the Fool is there to care for him, and we get so many gorgeous and tender moments between those two that you just can't handle it. And then fast forward to the Tawny Man trilogy, and that's really, really, really where their relationship starts to build and kind of come to a head. Really where all of these romantic overtures start to happen. And they don't necessarily seem like they're romantic overtures, but like the Fool admits his feelings for Fitz when Fitz confronts him about it. And they are very flirty with each other and they have a very unusual relationship. They're always sharing beds and holding hands and just very touchy-feely with each other. And then we get to Fool's Fate. Fool's Fate is one of the most heartbreaking books I have read in a very long time. Fool's Fate deals with Fitz and the Fool going on this quest to awaken / kill dragons. But the Fool is said to die on that journey. He predicted his own death on that journey, and Fitz wants to prevent that at all costs. And ultimately, the Fool kind of does die, but Fitz, through just this special link that they have this thing where when they touch, they basically start to meld and become one person. And in Fool's Fate, Fitz takes the Fool out of his body, and then he puts him back in his body and brings him back to life, basically. The scene where all of this is happening, where the Fool is basically dead in Fitz's arms and Fitz is just like literally losing his mind, is one of the most heartbreakingly beautiful scenes in the entire series. And I mean that with every fiber of my being. Like, it is one of the most heartbreakingly beautiful scenes of the series. And it's so sad at the same time, because once that happens, the Fool does not know how to handle that. He doesn't know how to handle not dying on this journey. And so he ultimately severs ties between the two of them, despite Fitz literally saying, I want to be with you. I want to stay with you. He leaves because he doesn't know what's to come. He doesn't know what them staying together will do to the world. And it's just so heartbreaking, because Fitz was literally willing to give up everything, his entire life, to go and be with the Fool. But the Fool grudgingly rejects that, and they part ways, and that's ultimately why Fitz ends up going back to Molly. Flash forward to the Fitz and the Fool trilogy. Fool's Assassin is very rough, because Fitz doesn't know what happened to the Fool. It's been like 20 years, man, and Fitz doesn't know what happened to the Fool. He hasn't heard from him in 20 years, so it's basically just Fitz having all this pining angst for almost 600 pages, and then the Fool finally comes back, and what does Fitz do? Stab him, and basically almost kill him once again. And it's even more heartbreaking because it's by Fitz's hand this time. It's not by some foreign entity. It's not by some unforeseen circumstance. Fitz is the one that did it himself. And then we get to Fool's Quest, and ultimately the Fool wants Fitz to go on this giant revenge streak for the Fool, to get back at the people who hurt him so terribly and upended his entire world and just basically destroyed his whole life. And Fitz isn't sure he wants to do it until he finds out that Bee has been taken by the same people that hurt the Fool. And it's really heartbreaking, and it's really gorgeous, because Fool's Quest is really where Fitz starts to accept the Fool. He accepts the Fool in every form he's ever been in, which is a huge deal, because Fitz could not accept the Fool for who he was before. He was always just like, you were this other person, why are you doing this to me? You're hiding all of these facets about yourself. whatever. He just blames the Fool for so much. Whereas in Fool's Quest, he finally starts to realize, he's like, you know, you are you. You are the Fool, Lord Golden, Amber, Mage Grey. You are you. And it's just the most beautiful scene in the entire world. Just them in every facet of the word. I mean, just the fact that they're basically merging together as one person anytime they touch. The fact that Fitz is willing to drop everything to avenge the Fool and to just keep him alive, just everything. He is Fitz's whole world in a lot of ways. And that's saying something because he has other family members who are very important to him as well, like Bee and Nettle and Molly. But no, the Fool is really everything to Fitz. And ultimately, when it comes to Assassin's Fate and just all of the stuff that ends up happening in it, Fitz cannot fully die and be himself without the Fool. He needs the Fool with him. And it's just stunningly beautiful because Fitz's and the Fool's relationship that is different than all of the others is Fitz does not have a proper label for what their relationship actually is. Occasionally he'll call him friend, but then he'll think about it and be like, wait, we're actually kind of more than friends. People will accuse Fitz and the Fool of being lovers, but he's like, no, we're not that either. We never did any of that. What we had went beyond that. People could argue that the Prophet Catalyst situation is a label for their relationship, but that doesn't define what their relationship actually was. They were more personas. They were more facets of their relationship, which was not the sole purpose of it. And just everything about them is undefinable. And when the Fool says in The Golden Fool, my love for you has no limits. I set no boundaries on my love. What he's essentially saying is, I don't just love you because you're a male and because you have a certain anatomy. I don't just love your heart. I love every facet of you. Basically, I love your soul, your being, everything about you, everything about your life, in every form that you take, in everything. It's not just about physical appearance. It's not just about a friendship bond or a found family bond or whatever. It is the most terrifying thing to Fitz because he's never experienced a love like the Fool has for him. And it is both gorgeous and heartbreaking at the same time because Fitz refuses to accept it, refuses to believe that he's worthy of something like that. He's terrified of the bond that they have. And that is ultimately what I think the merging situation is all about. It's all about the fact that the love that they have for each other has no limits, has no boundaries, exceeds everything, exceeds sex, exceeds physicality, exceeds every facet of everything. They're soulmates in the highest regard. And at the end, when Fitz and the Fool and Night Eyes merge into one being, that is when they are able to fully be themselves, fully, truly be happy. It is in a large way the biggest metaphor for Fitz ultimately accepting all the love in the world that the Fool has to offer, all the love that other people in the world want to give him. It's Fitz ultimately accepting that he is worthy and that he is loved without limits by someone in his life. He is loved by someone he doesn't have a label for. And I mean, that's why the scene in Assassin's Fate, when he's putting memories into the wolf, is so devastating. Because the Fool, when he's talking with the Fool at one point, he's like, what were we? It's like, we were friends, Prophet and Catalyst. It's like, You know what I mean. It's like, no limits. And Fitz is like, I know that would have meant something to me at one time. I'm going to put it in my wolf. I'm like, it is the most devastating thing in the world. That Fitz is basically just so gone that he doesn't fully understand it anymore. And I just can't deal with the fact that Fitz denied himself that for his whole life. And I still sit up thinking about the ending of the series at night on a regular basis. I think about a lot of aspects of the series on a regular basis, but the Fitz and the Fool relationship is one that I stay up and think about regularly. There's so much analysis over on Tumblr or on forums about these books, but in particular this relationship and Fitz's relationships to people. And honestly, I really just wanted to link you guys to my Tumblr tag so you can go through it and see all of the gorgeous artwork and all of the gorgeous posts about the series, so you can fully understand what I'm even trying to convey. But not even that can fully try and convey it. And it's just absolutely stunning that we get this series and we get these characters and we get these relationships and these interactions and these different types of love, whether it's familial love or the love of a parent to a child, the love of two lovers, of a husband and a wife, soulmates, or an animal and their human companion. I mean, you name it. These books embody every form of love that you can possibly conjure up in your head. And it is absolutely stunning what Robin Hobb has created. And I cannot fully express, I'm not even remotely joking, I cannot fully express what this series has done for me and what it means to me. But anyway, this video has gone on quite long enough, I think. And I hope my ramblingness made sense and that you got something out of this if you've read the series. And I'd love, if you don't know this already, I'd love to talk to any of you guys about it down below or on Twitter about any of the things that I talked about here today and anything beyond what I've talked about today. But other than that, you guys know the drill. Both of my social media links down below in the description. I have a Twitter, which is @ASeaOfTomes, which is the same as my handle over here. And I also have a Goodreads where you guys can go follow me and see what I'm reading and follow my progress and see my general thoughts on things before I come over here and scream at you about it. But other than that, I'll catch you later in another video for you guys again soon. Bye!